Welcome to Reddit Quest. Subscribe for more videos. Redditors who were alive during September 11th, where were you when you heard the news? Story 1. I heard it first on the radio in my car driving to school. I was a senior in high school. On the radio it was just mentioned that a plane had hit one of the buildings and was seemingly an accident. When I got to school after about an hour, everything stopped and we watched the TV. Everyone said we were going to war. I signed up and many other males did too on the Selective Service website that day because we thought we would be drafted. I still have my Selective Service card and laminated it because of the date on there. Years later I would find myself in the army in Iraq. Not once but twice. That is a different story, but one that I am ashamed of, as this country forced us to destroy an entire country and people for no goddamn reason at all. And now no one, no civilians bat an eye at what we went through and saw and/or carry with us to this day. So many veterans returned home with missing arms, legs, their lives for what? Absolutely nothing. There was no AQ in Iraq until after we invaded. Paul Bremer is an a-hole with blood on his hands for disbanding the Iraqi army. Created more enemies for us than necessary. On my second and last tour to Iraq in 2011, the Iraqi people didn't want us to leave. We left and then ISIS came in and if everything over again and created more orphans. This country has a lot of dark stains on it and I wish more so-called patriots would see that, but they don't give a F. Story 2. I was in my 4th grade class. The school administration decided not to tell anyone except kids who had parents, relatives that worked at the Pentagon World Trade Center until early afternoon. So I completely missed out on seeing anything live. Story 3. I was in 9th or 10th grade and didn't hear about it until I got home from school and turned on the television. I think I spent the rest of the day glued to the TV, not really grasping the gravity of the situation. That said, I don't remember much the days that followed. I was going to Catholic school, so they probably did some prayer thing in the gym or with the morning announcements, but I don't really remember much about the week or month that followed 9/11, how friends and family reacted to it. I just remember the 24HR news coverage. Story 4, 2nd grade. Lots of parents ran into the classroom to get their kids. School was in Queens. Even my teacher ran out. I waited in the office with a few other students, mostly minorities like me, until my mom came for me at the end of the day. My teacher lost her fireman fiance, and my mom and aunt worked the next few weeks helping clean the surrounding buildings of the towers. She says it smelled awful too. Story 5. I was in Costa Rica, at my dad's house. I got woken up by my stepmom's maid, who told me that a friend had called to inform me that New York was being bombed, and it was the end of the world. I was so hungover, I decided to just go back to sleep, and let the world end without me. Armageddon would have been sweet release at that point. Story 6. I was asleep when the attacks happened, was working second shift hours at the time and the attacks were early enough that I still got to sleep through them. I heard about it on the radio in my car when I was driving to school for some classes I was taking at the time. I remember hearing the reporter say the phrase, "where the Twin Towers were," and thinking that obviously the past tense was a misspeak. Then I learned the truth. Story 7. Still up from the previous night studying for a summer school final after my first year of college. Prof canceled the final and I believe we all just got passing grades. Spent the rest of the day with roommates watching everything unfold. It was surreal. Story 8. Elementary school, 4th grade I think. First they put it on the class TV, then they called the whole school to the cafeteria gym, same dual-purpose area, to watch the news, explain what happened and allowed some kids to ask questions. Then they sent us home early. My mother was actually home for once and my father was crying because he lost 2 old friends of his in the Pentagon. He showed me pictures of them, and my mother brought me outside to take note of how silent the sky was because no planes were flying. I never saw their faces look anything like they did that day ever again. Story 9. Working as a receptionist in an engineer company at the age of 20 with mostly Middle Eastern partners, they turned on the TV, and we all watched it. I had never even heard of the trade towers at the point. They looked at each other and said, "They are going to blame us." I didn't really understand what it meant when they said it, and they told me to go home because Houston was on the radar of potential targets. At 21 I joined the army, and by 22 I was serving in Iraq. It made me sad to think my bosses felt like they were going to be targeted, but my understanding of racism at the time was limited. Story 10. 7th grade Spanish class. Announcement came on the PA system and she threw it up on the TV. Then we got sent to the gymnasium for an assembly and sent home. We were very close to the location. People's parents actually worked up there. It was not good. Came home to my mom watching it on the news, and she never watched news. It was completely surreal. Story 11. I was in college and I had no classes that day, so I slept in. In those days I helped run an online text-based role-playing game in those days. Yes, I'm a nerd. And I always left myself logged in overnight so I could read back in the mornings to see if there were any player issues or anything I needed to know about. Only that day, all I saw was a repeated announcement asking people who were logged in via dial-up, kids in 2001, not everyone had broadband, in the Northeast US to please log out to keep the phone lines free for the emergency services, and a lot of chatter about planes I couldn't follow. So I went to check the news. I was on the West Coast, so this was hours after the attacks at this point, and the internet was plastered with grim pictures. I stared off into space, and doom scrolled. Story 12. I was 4, but I remember vividly for some reason. I was in the kitchen where my family was staring at our little white TV. Everyone was upset. I heard Rudolph and saw the tower, and I thought that Rudolph the reindeer had hit the antennae off of the Empire State Building. It was obviously about Rudolph Giuliani, but hey, I was teeny. My mom let me outside, and I remember I was upset because everyone was upset. I stood there throwing my Tonka truck against the fence. My mom remembers watching me through the window. Story 13. At home waking up, heard on clock radio that there was an airplane crash at the first tower. When I got up and got going, watched the news on our big projection TV we had at the time right when the second plane hit. It was unreal. Went to work where everyone was just watching the TV. Since we worked in a government building, after a little while, they sent us all home for fear of further attacks on government buildings. Story 14. I'm on the West Coast. I was still in bed when my radio alarm went off. The guy said a small plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. I turned on my TV. There was a shot of the building with black smoke coming out. I started to get up and get dressed. I was glancing at the TV when I saw a big plane crash into the World Trade Center. My first thought was that they were showing recorded footage and that was no small plane. Some reporters on the street started yelling that a second plane had just crashed into the World Trade Center. I then realized that this was a different building because the other was still smoking. The anchor back at the station said that they were getting unconfirmed reports that a second plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. Story 15. I was in college and racing down the stairs from the 5th floor, going 4 stairs at a time just to see if I could. I was late to kinesiology and struggling. Passed a girl crying in the stairwell and assumed it was boy drama. Hit the lobby where there was a TV the size of the wall, and in living color they were playing the plane crashing into the towers over and over. I came to a dead stop along with everyone else who walked in for the rest of that day and just stared at the TV in mute horror. I still can't believe the things we saw that day, the things people went through, the way people died. I remember my skin felt icy, like I wasn't in my body anymore, like I died too, just stood there, arms wrapped tightly around myself for hours. Story 16. Senior year of high school. One of my friends, who was a huge stoner, came up to me at my locker first thing in the morning, said, "Dude, did you see on the news some dumbass ran their airplane into the Sears Tower or something?" Story 17. I was in my 3rd grade music class. We came back to our homeroom class and the teacher, one of my all-time favorites, told us that something terrible has happened before putting the TV on. We watched as the second plane crashed into the towers. At the same time, the pastor at my church was also Navy chaplain. He was in DC for an interview to become a chaplain for Navy SEALs at the Pentagon. He said that he was in the parking lot and watched as the plane crashed into the building. Story 18. This was my first week in college. I was on my way to a 9 a.m. Spanish class, and the guy on my freshman hall who habitually lied about everything to make himself seem cooler told me that planes were flying into the World Trade Center. I'm pretty sure I told him to F off. Story 19. During my student teaching, we were having an assembly and I was in the back of the auditorium. There was a teacher standing next to me with a clipboard that had a printout from the internet that said, "Plane crashes into WTC." I thought what class this odd lesson is being taught in. After about a minute, I started to notice the looks on other teachers' faces as people were walking in and out of the room. I went outside to the hall to find a large group huddled around a radio. We sent the kids home early that day. Story 20. I was in my English classroom teaching 7th graders. We were doing a unit that we teachers called Death and Depression, Mouse, Hiroshima, Anne Frank, as part of the William and Mary curriculum. A colleague came into my portable classroom and whispered into my ear, "I just want you to know that there have been reports that a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center." Being in a suburb of DC, some of my students' parents worked at the Pentagon. Not a fun time. Story 21. I was in school, in New York. They sent all the kids home. Back in those days, we didn't need parents to take us out. They literally just said, "Go home." I was like, sweet. I still didn't know how serious it was until I was all the memorials at all the fire stations of the guys who died at those specific stations, weeks following after. Story 22. I was in Union Square in Manhattan, almost 2 miles away but a good view of the tower. Everyone was just standing around looking up as I got out of the subway. No answers, no fear, just confusion. Figured it was a bad fire and they would put it out. I shrugged and went up in my building. Woman next to me was crying hysterically because her brother worked in the tower. That's when I realized this would be something was really bad. We had almost no phone service, no TV signal, and no working internet. Just lots of rumors for the next few minutes till we saw the second tower burst in flames, couldn't see the plane. It was a few hours before we knew what was really up, stayed at work till the towers collapsed, then walked 80 blocks home surrounded by people crying and covered in debris. Story 23. My buddy called me from my porch at like 8:30 and said, "Come out here and hit this bong." After a bit we called our buddy to re-up and he said, "Turn on the TV, we're under attack." We said, "Holy-ish, that's crazy, can we swing by and get that?" Story 24. I didn't hear about it till I got to work. No one was at their desks. I thought I missed a day off memo or maybe I accidentally came in on a Saturday, but I found everyone in the conference rooms huddled around the TVs. Story 25. I was in school. My buddy's dad was supposed to be piloting one of the planes but switched with someone at the last minute. Story 26. I was in 6th grade sitting in the cafeteria. At first I thought it must have been a small plane like a Cessna. It wasn't until I got home and saw my mom bawling that I knew that it was much more than that. I'll never forget how beautiful the weather was that day. Amazing blue sky with not a cloud in sight. I wish it never happened, and those towers were still there. Story 27. I was at home. It was around 5:30 p.m. in India. I heard from my mom. My dad ended up stuck in Amsterdam because he was actually on his way to the US at the time. Story 28. In my 3rd grade classroom. A teacher came running down the halls screaming to turn on the TVS. My teacher turned it on, and the first tower had already been hit. I just remember the classroom becoming completely silent, my teacher's hands covering her mouth. We all sat there and watched when the second one hit. That's when the teachers began to panic because I remember everything became loud again, and so many adults were coming in and out of the rooms now. I remember feeling scared. All of my classmates slowly began to get picked up by their parents one by one. I was one of the last ones to leave. My neighbor had gotten me, and I cried because I was so little and thought maybe my parents were in what I'd just seen and died. Then I spent the following weeks and months glued to the TV, awaiting the times when they'd announce the names and/or count of all they've found so far. Growing up, we flew a lot because we had a lot of family living elsewhere. I loved planes. After that, I was terrified of them, and I still am. I have an irrational fear of dying in a place crash, and I can't help but contribute it to this moment in my life. Story 29. Home. 6 a.m. on the West Coast when I turned on the TV to watch my early morning cartoons as I was getting ready for school, 7th grade. Instead, I saw the news and 2 burning buildings. It was all we talked about during first period, and I remember being scared that planes could crash into our schools at any given moment. Story 30. Fort Meade in Maryland. NSA thought they might be a target, so the whole base went on lockdown with concrete barriers at the gates within a few hours. High school sent us home and we just stared at the news waiting for any updates. Since my dad was working at the Pentagon at the time, it was genuinely terrifying. Story 31. Came home from school. My mom was standing in front of the TV completely quiet with a grim look. The TV just showed footage of the planes crashing with text rolling at the bottom. No voiceover, completely quiet. Story 32. On a university campus near a Navy base. Classes canceled and the campus went on lockdown. My fiancé, his brother and I all met up in one of the commons that had a TV to watch the coverage. We eventually ended up in my fiancé's dorm room. He had a TV card in his computer, so we hung out there. His brother left when the lockdown ended. He didn't live on campus like we did. Story 33. In bed. My girlfriend at the time ran in and told me what happened. I thought I was dreaming at first, turned on the TV and sat there in disbelief as the towers came down. I went to work because that's all I could think to do. I only stayed for 2 hours. No one was actually working, and we all just decided to call it a day. I went home and hugged my girlfriend and our roommates extra hard as we started to process everything. It was unreal. Story 34. I saw it happen live on TV when I was 4. I remember my mom being really glued to the screen. Of course, I didn't understand the significance of the event at the time. Story 35. I had just moved into a duplex and spent my first night on September 10th. I hadn't been able to move all of my stuff, so my furniture wasn't coming up till my dad brought it the following week. I was sleeping on the floor with my tiny TV VCR combo. My mom called me and told me to turn on the news. She was up early and always watched CNN. She was upset because calls to Boston, where my sister lived, weren't going through. My best friend's dad was retired military but fairly high-ranking, so we thought he might be a good resource if things got bad, and he only lived an hour away. Mom told me to go to her apartment in case our phone stopped working. I went to her place, I stopped on my way to tell a friend who was pumping gas, and then I spent the day watching it on television. My other friends had the same thought and went there too. I remember watching the towers fall. I remember talking to each other and saying there were probably hundreds of people dead. It didn't even occur to us that not everyone evacuated, and the deaths weren't just people close to the building. My friend's dad called to tell us about the Pentagon and the other plane, but that was it. Story 36. School. I was in 4th grade and I remember it was a Tuesday as we were lining up for Mass, Catholic school. Some boys ahead of me were talking and I overheard them like, "Yeah," and then they flew the plane into the building and it blew up. And I remember thinking, dang, what kinds of video games are their parents letting them play? Then we get to Mass and the priest immediately steps forward and I, who'd only been regularly attending Mass since starting at this school the prior month, was like, "Wait, this isn't how it works." And the priest goes, "I'm sure we all know what happened." And I had no clue, but everyone else was looking somber and nodding, so I just followed along. I had to try and piece it together from what the priest was saying, but still didn't really know what was going on until I asked my mom later. Story 37. I was at work managing my team to deal with dumb support calls and on conference calls with offices in the US. We heard while on one of those conference calls, so everything went a bit batshit. Spent a while trying to track a colleague down who had traveled to the US for work and had said he was going to visit the towers and no one knew where he was. After a few hours, I found him safe and sound in Boston. He had actually gone to see the towers the day before, but I was getting to the point where I thought I need to contact his family. My cousin spent his honeymoon on a flight to NYC, watching a plane smash into the second tower from their plane window and then flying back to the UK. They didn't want to fly anywhere for quite a while after that. Story 38. I was at school in Newark, New Jersey, 6th or 7th grade, I think. The smoke from the towers even reached us and made the sky gray for most of the day. We were all sent home and just watched it on the TV as it was happening. Some dude jumped out of the window. A whole bunch of office workers were screaming for help, but the fire truck's ladder was only so long and couldn't reach them, so a lot of people died that day on live TV. We basically saw it from beginning to end. One tower leaned up against the other for a good while, until they both just crumbled and fell. The amount of smoke was crazy. We had a view of the NY skyline from where we lived in Newark, and it was nothing but smoke everywhere. Story 39. At home, my ex called me and told me a small plane hit a tower, and I turned on the news, and when the second one hit, I lost my ish. I can't really describe how it felt. I lived near a nuclear power plant at the time, and after the Pentagon got hit, I just started freaking out completely. I remember my mom saying, "We are at war." Her words were terrifying, and at the time it really felt like it was going to keep happening. Story 40. College. Had an 8 a.m. class, got out at 9 and walked to the student union after to study for a bit before my 10 o'clock. There was a big screen TV over in the more lounge-ish area, and I saw 5 people standing and watching, which was odd, though I couldn't see the screen. I had my headphones on and work to do, so I sat down and got to it. Kept looking up to see more and more people watching, so when 9:50 rolled around and I got up to leave, I walked over. One tower was on the screen with a headline about an airplane impact and smoke pouring from what looked like a fairly small hole, opposite side of the impact. I assumed small prop plane due to the size of the hole, and didn't really register it as a major event. I went to class, and when I sat down I got the rest of the details from other students. Both towers, large impacts, likely hundreds of dead in a terrorist attack. Professor comes in and kinda shrugs and says if you need to leave you can, but I'm going to go ahead with class. Everyone stayed. An hour later I'm on the bus as the one girl with a cell phone is reading off a news alert/text about both towers collapsing, and I didn't believe her. Turned on the TV in my dorm when I got back and called my mom to see if my travels for a living father was anywhere near the East Coast. Good thing he was in Texas. Story 41. I was in 4th grade at school at my hometown, which is a rural town in Missouri. We didn't really know anything mostly until the last class of the day, PE. Now we could feel something was wrong and there were whispers, but us being kids didn't really grasp what had just occurred. At PE, our teacher, who was ex-Marines and jacked from head to toe, kept "I'm from NYC." Sophomore year of college in Boston, I woke up and walked out of my dorm room toward the bathroom. Ran into a floor mate who said, "You're from NY, right? Have you seen the news?" Went back to my room and turned on the TV. Roommate, from Connecticut. and I stood there speechless. Called my mom, grandma, aunt, cousin, couldn't get through to anyone. BC phone lines were crazy. Went to my work-study job, and my boss, who was from NY, told me to go home. Went back to my dorm and finally got through to my mom, who was oddly calm about the whole thing. Everyone we knew was fine. I got through to her right after the first tower fell. We'll never forget how weird I thought it was that the second tower to get hit was the first to fall. By the time the second tower fell, we'd gotten disconnected and I wasn't sure which of my classes were canceled, so I went to class. Every prof TA told us to go home unless we wanted to stay and talk. Except one 80-year-old prof who insisted on holding his statistics lecture despite everyone being worried our campus was the next target. Hijackers came from Boston Logan. I ended up being able to get back to NY about 3 weeks later and tried to get to Ground Zero. Looking back, I guess I felt like it would give me closure somehow, like I felt guilty for not being in NY when it happened. Closest we got was Houston Street. Everything south was blocked off. I remember how eerily quiet it was, how there was no traffic. People were walking down the middle of Broadway. Everything was covered in ash. There were cars parked on side streets that you could tell had been there since it happened by the layer of ash on them. Of the few people actually around, no one was really talking. And the smell, oof, that smell. Like the tarmac at an airport, but acider and more burnt. It was surreal, unnatural. I felt violated on a personal level, like how could someone do this to my city, my hometown? I think that's why I ended up transferring schools and coming home to NY. I felt like I needed to be there to heal, to process what had happened. Breaking down, crying, yelling, just a mess, and I think that's when we started piecing together something truly horrible had happened. We were led back to our classroom and our teacher read from a pre-written paper about the attack, how it happened and that an unknown but large amount of people had died in the attack. I went home still kind of processing it when I saw my grandpa, who was ex-Navy and who lived next door washing his truck, which he did every week, but instead of seeing the smiling, gentle man, I had grown up knowing he was stone-faced and monotone. I remember the days after, a line a mile long at the gas stations, talks of war, a train rolling through my town carrying miles of military hardware including Humvees and Abrams tanks. Sometime soon after that, I remember seeing all of the footage, the people jumping from the buildings, the crack they made outside when they hit the ground is still ingrained in my mind. The second plane careening into the second tower, the collapsing towers and the huge clouds of dust that chased people from the streets, the firefighters desperately trying to get people out before the collapse, the calls from people on the planes and in the towers knowing it was all hopeless and knew they were gonna die. It was all just mad and so incredibly sad at the same time. Story 42, 9th grade chemistry. My teacher was odd and her whole demeanor about the thing was very casual, so most of us didn't think anything of it. They went on the PA system, but ours was broken, and we had to visit the neighboring classroom to hear. It was like stepping into another world, crying, group hugs, kids trying to make a phone call. Story 43. I was in 3rd grade. We were called down to an assembly about 4 hours after everything stopped, I remember. A, being interrupted from writing the cursive letter G to go to the assembly. B, the principal calling up to show where we were on the map, where DC was, where NYC was, etc. C, I was in a different area due to noise issues and I saw all the teachers gasping in shock and the kids wondering what it all meant. If the teachers gasped, it had to be bad. But no one explained to us what the World Trade Center was. Story 44, asleep as I was a kid in Australia, and this occurred around 11 p.m. our time. As a family, we were staying at our aunt and uncle's place. I would have been 10. I remember waking up next morning hoping to catch the Sunday morning kids cartoons, only to find instead the channel was a live feed of CNN, and there was shots of this plane hitting a big business tower played again and again. As a kid, I guess you don't have that sort of connection to what an event it was. But I realized even then that this wasn't some movie but instead something very serious, and one of those major moments, my whole family was glued to the couch watching dumbstruck. The last time I'd had the same feeling was Princess Diana's death, which was similarly broadcast all evening when that happened. Just one of those big moments in history, but 9/11 everyone had a sad response. There was a year of grieving and fear, I'd say, across the world, and certainly was the last time anyone traveled stress-free in an airport. Like the Manson murders to end the hippie 60s, 9/11 was sort of the event to end the relative innocence of the 90s. Suddenly as a kid I was face to face with death and destruction, and there was nothing any adult could do to shield me from seeing that pain. Story 45, I'm from NYC. Sophomore year of college in Boston, I woke up and walked out of my dorm room toward the bathroom, Ran into a floor mate who said, "You're from NY, right? Have you seen the news?" Went back to my room and turned on the TV, roommate from Connecticut, and I stood there speechless. Called my mom, grandma, aunt, cousin, couldn't get through to anyone. BC phone lines were crazy. Went to my work-study job and my boss, who was from NY, told me to go home. Went back to my dorm and finally got through to my mom, who was oddly calm about the whole thing. Everyone we knew was fine. I got through to her right after the first tower fell. We'll never forget how weird I thought it was that the second tower to get hit was the first to fall. By the time the second tower fell, we'd gotten disconnected, and I wasn't sure which of my classes were canceled, so I went to class. Every prof TA told us to go home unless we wanted to stay and talk. Except one 80-year-old prof who insisted on holding his statistics lecture despite everyone being worried our campus was the next target. Hijackers came from Boston Logan. I ended up being able to get back to NY about 3 weeks later and tried to get to ground zero. Looking back, I guess I felt like it would give me closure somehow, like I felt guilty for not being in NY when it happened. Closest we got was Houston Street. Everything south was blocked off. I remember how eerily quiet it was, how there was no traffic. People were walking down the middle of Broadway. Everything was covered in ash. There were cars parked on side streets that you could tell had been there since it happened by the layer of ash on them. Of the few people actually around, no one was really talking. And the smell, oof, that smell. Like the tarmac at an airport, but acrider and more burnt. It was surreal, unnatural. I felt violated on a personal level, like how could someone do this to my city, my hometown? I think that's why I ended up transferring schools and coming home to NY. I felt like I needed to be there to heal, to process what had happened. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.